All right. Welcome to Hillwood's Orchid Month celebration and our repotting demonstration today. My name is Erin Lurie, and I am the head of adult audiences here at Hillwood. We are joined by the lovely and talented Drew Asbury. We're going to talk a little bit today about repotting your orchids. But first, I'd like to invite those of you who are in the DC area to please come and visit Hillwood. We are open Tuesday through Sunday, 10 to 5, and the orchids in the greenhouse are absolutely stunning right now. March is the time when the largest variety of orchids is in bloom. And while you're here, you can also enjoy, of course, the splendors of the mansion, the spring gardens, which are bursting into bloom, and the special exhibition on display now in the dacha called The Luxury of Clay, Porcelain Past and Present. This afternoon, Drew Asbury, our horticulturalist and volunteer manager, is going to be talking a little bit about orchid care and repotting to keep your plants happy and healthy. As we go along, please feel free to submit any questions that cross your mind through the Q&A module that is located at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. If you keep funneling questions there, which is separate from the chat, that will help us make sure that we don't miss any as new questions come in. Without further ado, I will introduce Drew. As I mentioned, he is the horticulturalist and volunteer manager. He joined Hillwood in 2012, and he's responsible for the greenhouses, cutting garden, and the horticulture volunteer program. Drew has worked professionally in the horticulture industry for nearly 20 years in a variety of positions, including garden center sales, greenhouse growing, and landscape management and design. Drew graduated from the Longwood Gardens Professional Gardener Training Program in 2006 and completed a master's degree in sustainable garden design from the George Washington University in 2020. Drew, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Hey, thank you, Erin, so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm super excited to be here today to talk to you about this topic of repotting orchids. So I'm hoping in the next 20-30 minutes or so, we're going to do some live repotting demonstrations. We're going to do a couple Phalaenopsis. We will not be doing this particular plant because we generally don't repot while things are in bloom, but this is the Phalaenopsis orchid, big strappy leaves. This is the one you see quite often for sale at every grocery store, and it is labeled as a great one for beginners. I completely agree. So keep that in mind. The Phalaenopsis is the one we'll be doing a couple of. And then we will have time for repotting one of these lovely beauties. These are the Cattleyas, the really strong, also known as a corsage orchid that has really strong fragrance. This was Marjorie Post's favorite orchid. Again, we will not be repotting this bad boy while he's in the middle of bloom here, but we'll have a non-blooming specimen to work with. So we'll have a couple of different examples to look at today and work our way through. But before we immediately dive into this idea of repotting, I really feel it's super important to really talk about, why are we repotting? And, particularly, to grow a happy orchid, right? Repotting is a bit of a trickier concept than maybe a traditional house plant. And that's because the vast majority of orchids in our collection, as well as those that come from the tropical regions of the world in general, grow as epiphytes. So both of the Phalaenopsis and the Cattleya examples we just looked at are epiphytes. And epiphytes is basically just a fancy horticultural term for a plant that does not grow in the ground, but rather it's a plant that uses its roots here to not only absorb water like we typically think of roots in a plant, but they also use that to attach themselves to a structure and then grow on that structure. So very similar, those pictures you've seen in magazines and such, or if you've been to tropical rainforest, right? It's all those plants that are growing on tops of the tree trunks and the tree branches in their native habitat. So, if this is a tree trunk, imagine for a moment, and some orchid seed, which is tiny, is flying around in the air. And if it lands in one of these little crevices and all the stars and align in the perfect order and everything's just perfect, that plant will germinate on that piece of bark, and it will, its roots will sprout out, attaching themselves firmly, and it will never leave that space. So having a lifestyle in that manner where you're clinging onto the side of a tree high up in the canopy, that has really drastic implications for how we're going to take that plant out of nature, right? And then, of course, you know, you could grow a plant, and here at Hillwood, we grow a lot of things actually mounted. You can barely even see, but deep inside this is a little piece of that cork bark that I was just showing. But yet that plant, we mounted that probably 5 years ago as a little baby. And then year after year, as it grows and matures, it is basically, you can see a little bit of that, maybe that little bit of the backside of the piece of wood there. But, you know, and that's going to be its whole life, right? It's always going to be on there and such. But yeah, you could do that at home too, but it's a bit of a mess, okay? So that's why us as humans, you know, we want to put everything into containers. And that's how I grow all my orchids at home. 95% of our orchids here at Hillwood are also in pots and such like that. But yet the implications, right? What does this imply? Well, basically those roots are exposed to the elements. They're exposed to sunlight and a lot of wind, right? They're not protected in that nice soil layer that typical roots are. So when we're thinking about orchids, we want to try to recreate that natural habitat of that epiphytic nature, which implies we want a media or a potting, you know, mix that has really, really good air around it. So this is why we're going to see this today, and it's a little, we're going to really messy here today. But here's an example. This is a chunky fir bark based media that I have here pre-soaking, but it's big chunks, right? What do those big chunks allow? Well, they allow, when they're inside that pot, there's all these pockets of air also in that pot surrounding the roots. And then you can imagine with big chunky bark like that, when you water, the water flushes through very quickly. It pulls more oxygen into the pot and such like that. So that's how we trick the plant into thinking it has those epiphytic characteristics, but yet it's growing in a pot. Okay. But
And
what
Drew,
happens after everything? Yes, Erin, go ahead.
sorry, I'm going to hop right in.
Yeah.
Alyssa just asked if it's possible for you to adjust the screen a little bit so that we can see more of that pot, or maybe just pull that pot back towards you.
How about that?
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Erin.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, you know, how can we recreate that epiphytic nature is by using this really large chunky media that provides air and good drainage. But yet what happens after a couple of years, right? That bark starts to break down. It starts to, those pockets of air begin to collapse, right? The water doesn't drain through as quickly. It starts staying moist too long, right? So these are the reasons why we are then every couple of years or so, we're taking that plant out of the pot, removing that old soil, and then replanting it into a often the same size pot, but with fresh media around the roots. Okay, so that idea of always keeping that epiphytic nature of lots of air and lots of drainage around the roots is super, super important to grow healthy orchids. So with that, let's hop right in. It's super messy. Luckily, I'm here at Hillwood in our potting room, which is a messy place to work, so it's perfect. But at home, I would recommend to work out in your garage or outside if it's warm, or layer down lots of newspaper or cardboard or something that'll make cleanup easier. You're going to need a variety. Well, I use a variety of scissors, but you just need one nice pair of scissors. You're going to want to have several different pots to choose from. We'll talk about how do you choose which size pot. It's all basically, you can't tell until you get your orchid out of its existing pot and all that old soil removed. And you really base the pot size on what your root system looks like. Okay, so we'll talk about that as we go through the examples. But what I want to stress now is, do you see the drainage hole? It's an absolute imperative characteristic for orchids. They have to have a drainage hole. These is a lovely little, what they're often called orchid pots, and they actually have extra drainage holes on the side. Not necessary, but they're perfectly fine. You'll also see we have, sometimes we use plastic pots, sometimes we use clay pots. There's advantages and disadvantages to both techniques, but that's really a lot of personal preference, honestly. So let's just hop in now and let's grab an orchid. I cheated a little bit. I brought some orchids in from home because, well, I'm not as good at repotting my plants at home as we are here. So this is one that I bought maybe a couple years ago. And luckily there's so many of these days are sold in plastic pots, so it's a nice way that you can kind of keep an eye on your roots. You can see some of these aerial roots that are coming out of the sides. Let me see how I think everybody can see those. These are aerial roots, and before I forget, that's something during the repotting process. We get asked about this all the time. What to do with those roots that are out in the air? I generally do not recommend to force those into the pot when you're repotting. They are already adjusted and accustomed to living life out completely exposed to the air, and that's perfectly okay. Okay. So first step is to squeeze your pot. Okay, and I can already tell this guy's going to come out pretty easily, but often they get stuck. Okay, that's one of the disadvantages of clay, is that they love orchid roots, just like they would be in nature, grip onto things. So this is a situation where if you have a plant that it does not want to come out of its pot by a simple tugging, then what you can do is soak your plant for a couple minutes in lukewarm water. And what that does is it really makes the roots a lot more soft and pliable. And potentially it will help avoid unnecessary breakage. And yeah, being a little bit more pliable is maybe beneficial. This is a bit of a traumatic experience. So as I talk here, I'm just going to start physically removing. Now this plant is growing in a sphagnum moss type media. We're going to talk about the medias here too. I know I already mentioned that chunky fir bark media. That is what we use for the vast majority of our orchids here. I myself, as an orchid grower for the past 20 years with a little home orchid collection, I've always been a bark-based person, a fan of bark medias. Here at Hillwood, we're basically bark-based for the majority of our collection. And our orchid and tropical plant specialist, Andrew, who takes care of the daily affairs of our collection, his home collection is also bark-based too. So for us, we kind of lean heavily towards bark, but this material that I'm moving now is sphagnum moss. Here's some nice clean things of sphagnum moss. Let me see, I get nice, and everything focus here. Sphagnum moss looks so different than that chunky fir bark, but yet it's doing the same thing inside of a pot. It allows for a lot of air to be around the roots, and it allows for that good drainage. But with that said, today we're not too much talking about all the care of the orchids, and I think Erin might be posting. We did an Orchid 101 tutorial a week or two ago, and that's available on Hillwood's YouTube channel to check out. And that's where we really talked a lot about watering and caring and how to get your plant to rebloom and all that. And we did talk about medias a little bit to use, but we didn't go in too much depth. Whereas today we're really just focusing on this whole repotting process. But you can see I'm just taking my time. You could do this under, removing this original soil. You could do this underneath the sink if you wanted. You could clog up your kitchen sink really quickly.
So and again, Drew, I'm going to just hop in really quickly. We have started getting a flurry of great questions.
Okay, sure.
And I think you've touched on a few of these, but we had two different questions come in about the difference between the inner pots that are plastic or doing terracotta pots or something else that's solid and ceramic. So Marla wanted to know if it was okay to use that plastic insert pot, as long as there are good drainage holes. And Kathy asked a question about how the roots of plants in different types of pots grow better, and whether it would be better to be growing in terracotta for the roots or...
Oh yes, that's that question we get asked all the time. So okay, the first question, yes, what you would want to do, no matter what pots you have, plastic, clay, decorative, they need to have drainage. Now, what I do at home is if you have some fancy pots that maybe don't have drainage, right, or the pretty ones that you want people to see, yes, you can have that there. But when you go to water your orchid, you have to have another pot inside that fancy pot that you take out and you take to the sink and you thoroughly water it, right? Because all that water is flushing through. And again, that's what that 101, Orchid 101 is, we talk about that a lot, right? So yes, you can use a decorative pot. You could plant it in the decorative pot too, as long as there is drainage holes. And then for Kathy's question, that is so today's experience is just my recommendations as an orchid grower. And for anyone who has dared to Google how to repot an orchid, you will find 42,000 different orchid enthusiasts out there, and they all have their own slight tweak on how what they like to do, right? And that might be based, if you're growing in Miami or Washington, D.C. or North Dakota, that might slightly influence, right? Because that's just, that's a different climate, right? So when it comes to plastic versus clay, I would say that's a 50-50 split too. Clay allows your plants to breathe, or their pot to breathe. It dries out quicker, which is more along the lines of an epiphytic environment.
And I'm just going to hop in there and specify that when you're talking about clay, you're talking about unglazed terracotta.
And it could be glazed too, but
okay.
Yes, Erin, unglazed, glazed or unglazed. Unglazed would breathe out a little bit more moisture. But honestly, it all depends on your personal opinion. At home, my whole collection's in clay because I like that look, right? So just like I've always been a fan of bark. So I think that we can revisit those questions too, but I'm at the point now where now it's the time. What I've been doing this whole time while I've been talking and I'm doing this is I've also been looking, okay, do I see brown mushy roots? Do I see black roots? Do I see broken roots? And I'll say, folks, I purposely chose this one. I could tell through this clear pot it had pretty good roots. Our next example does not have as good of roots. So when I start seeing this, I do want to use sterile scissors. Here at Hillwood, we use a flame to torch between we're cutting from this plant to the next plant. At home, you could use a little 10% bleach solution if you want to sterilize your scissors from one plant to the next. Orchids are generally, they can get viruses and such, especially in a big collection like Hillwood. So all I'm going to do, folks, I'm going to go in, let me cut out one or two here that I really don't like the looks of, and then I'll hold it up a little closer to the camera. Some of these ones that I'm cutting off here. Okay, so just keep trimming off a few. Again, I'm trimming off. These roots look really good. So, and this is, there's different schools of thoughts on this too. Some people are aggressive when it comes to removing roots. Other people are not so aggressive. I'm reduced maybe about 15% of the roots so far. When this is also a good time, you can see, let me get it in focus here. There's an old bloom stalk. If you see that tan stem, no, maybe about there. My top of my scissors is on it. Basically, that was an old bloom stalk that's now dead. I'm going to chop that out. Other just brown, softer roots here. And so some of the ones that I cut off here, you can start beginning to see a little bit of discoloration. Now, I'm sorry, this is not the best lighting, but you can start seeing some brown as opposed to a nice, healthier part of the root that's down a little further. I can also feel here that this has no substance left to it. It's a bit mushy. This part of this root is black, mushy, desiccated. Like there's no plumpness left, right? Now, if you take off all your plants and that's the best looking roots, those are not the worst looking roots in the world. If that was your best roots, well, I might leave that on another plant if I had a lot more black and mushy roots. And that might be our next example. So now this is the time that you can see I'm already down to here. 95% of that old mix is finished. And now this is when I decide what size pot I'm going to put it in. But you can see it came from a pretty small pot. But I think it's time for ever so slightly larger pot. I'm going to flip it over to clay because, again, I like clay and this is my collection at home. Now, with that said, I'll already throw a weird variable in there. For one reason or another, we do grow more of our orchids here at Hillwood in plastic. Because it's easier to control virus. Again, virus is a common problem in really large old collections. It's not so much of an issue if you only have a couple Phalaenopsis at home. So, but viruses the plastic is not able to absorb viruses like a clay pot might necessarily be able to. So when I put my plant in, there's no soil in there. I have my drainage hole. As I put my plant in, if I needed to, often I spiral it a wee bit. And again, normally I would have this, let's see, I think you all can still see that. Let me move this back a little bit more. So I'm spiraling a little bit. I'm letting those aerial roots that were out stay out. And you don't have to spiral. It's only because I have a lot of roots in there. So rather than like forcing it down, this kind of helps them start getting into the direction because I always like to reset my Phalaenopsis. It's a monopodial orchid. So new roots will keep coming out between these leaves. So every 2 years when you repot, if you can sit it ever so slightly lower in the pot. You're kind of resetting it and getting those new roots a little bit closer. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep this, I'm going to kind of show you, you know, all the roots are down inside my pot here. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to hold my hand, I'm going to hold my one hand, we're on that crown, because now I don't want that plant to move as I'm potting. Now I went over here, and this is the mix I'm using today is, what's it called? Better Grow Special Orchid Mix. Now this is not necessary. We use a wholesale professional grade stuff here at Hillwood, but we order a mass, right? This is what is available, commonly available at every single garden center, or something similar to this. This is a chunky epiphytic orchid mix, right? If you're choosing which mix to use, you know, I would definitely advise one that actually uses the word orchid on it as the first thing. But right here, it literally says potting mix for Phalaenopsis, Cattleyas, Dendrobiums, blah, 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 and all epiphytic orchids. And then it goes into explain over here about the quick drainage and the air around the roots. Okay, so I'm teaching from the bag here. So, and then what I do is it comes out of that bag super dry. So last night I put this into a big tub with water. I like to pre-soak my bark because that bark is super, super dry when it comes out. And now folks, this is actually pretty easy. All I am is literally holding onto that plant, and I'm gonna start using, I just use my fingers, no tools. And I'm literally pushing down in around those roots. I try not, you know, this is where it becomes a little bit of experience, right? Of like how hard to press. Like, you know, as you can see, I'm not paying too terribly much attention because I had so many great roots. I'm not too concerned. If I only had 2 or 3 nice big roots, then I probably would be a little bit more careful where I'm pressing down. But I am trying to get in underneath, you know, around those other, you know, those big gaps in there, but this is a pretty big chunky media. Sometimes if I had a baby plant, like this bag of bark comes, and there's quite a variety of sizes from small, maybe nickel or penny size pieces to like almost $half pieces. I often, you know, if I want to be nice to my orchids and I'm repotting a lot, I actually start to separate and sort the bag a little bit, and I'll save the huge pieces. I'll set aside for a larger plant or something like a Cattleya that likes even more drainage than average. And maybe I'll use the smaller pieces for something like a Phalaenopsis, which generally likes a little bit more moisture. You know, it's all relative to what you have in your collection.
And Drew, I'm going to hop in again with a couple of questions have come up about orchids that are in bloom.
Yeah. Yeah,
we want to wait to repot those, right?
You want to wait. I think, Erin, you know that too, right? Now, you can do it, and occasionally we do it around here. When we do these repotting workshops, normally in person, folks, there's always someone in the group that brings a blooming orchid. And the spiel is okay, look, you can do it, but if anything that agitates that plant, right, which this is a traumatic experience, that's you know, we won't beat around the bush, right? If that plant's not happy, it will abort those flowers. It's the first thing it's going to give up on, right? So this is the same reason why a lot of people often, they buy their plant out and then they get it home, and 2 or 3 weeks later, the buds turn yellow and they drop off. Well, that's because, you know, maybe they didn't necessarily go through a traumatic repotting experience, but they were transporting the car, you know, if weather drops or anything that, you know, if you put it in a home next to a heater vent that's really dry, there's, you know, any really a sudden change in that plant's environment could attempt the flowers to look, you know, to drop off. So if you really wanted to repot, you know, ideally you want to wait until after it's done blooming.
And
how's that, Erin?
That's great, Drew. I know you also talked a little bit about the reasons that here at Hillwood, we tend to go towards a bark-based medium.
Yeah.
Ronnie asked if it was necessary to or valuable to think about what a plant had been potted in previously, or whether you just pick your favorite medium, the one that you have on hand at home.
No, that's a really valid question. And there are different schools of thought on that very exact question. Yes, if your plant's used to moss, will it be less traumatic if it goes back into moss? Maybe is the question. Potentially, that makes rational sense to me. But yet, again, the idea is if you Google how to repot your orchid, right, I'm just mentioning 2 different potting medias today. And let me tell you, in our potting room here, we probably have 12 different amendments. And this is where it can get tricky. Like, you know, if you're growing a plant that naturally grows, you know, connected to rocky limestone outcroppings, right? This is where you'll put chips of limestone in with your potting mix to help adjust that alkalinity, you know, and again, we're trying to replicate the plant's natural habit. Plants that tend to like a little bit more moisture, like Phalaenopsis, you'll often see more often planted in a sphagnum moss, because the sphagnum moss holds a lot more moisture than a park-based media. So, you know, maybe the better answer is what type of water are you? Or do you leave and go on vacation for 2 or 3 weeks out of the year and no one's paying attention to your plants, right? That's when you might want to lean towards a moss media, compared to a bark, which, you know, the typical norm for a bark is about once a week watering. But maybe, at least for me in my home, where I do have some of these that I bought in moss, I will not water this every week. If I watered this every week, I would most certainly overwater it because it's growing in moss. So I know I'm throwing a lot of variables out there. Again, we talked a ton about that in our Orchid 101 class, so I'd highly recommend anyone to check that out. So
and as Drew mentioned, that is on our YouTube channel. I'll drop the link in the chat in just a moment, but I have 2 more questions that are both the same. So I'm going to interject before you move on.
Let me start, while you're doing that, I'm going to start tickling the root balls off of this one. And that's what, and then we'll repot it together. But that's what I'm going to work on. So go ahead, Erin.
Excellent. We've got 2 questions that came in about bloom stalks, and if, how, and when you cut those off.
Yeah. So if we're talking about repotting, I would cut my old bloom stalks off while I'm repotting. So, you know, generally, again, the idea of repotting, you don't want to do it while it's blooming. So, but generally then otherwise, if the question is about a Phalaenopsis bloom stalk, right, where you would cut it after it's done blooming is generally all the way down here at the base between the leaves. But what often we get asked a lot, right, is about this idea of, can I cut my plant back? If you Google it, it'll often recommend to cut your plant back along the stem. And what that will do is encourage potentially some side branches. And then prolong the flower, right? This is, you know, go for it if that's what you want to do. But often I don't encourage that necessarily for the first time you get a plant, because the plant's getting acclimated to your house. Yeah, but if that's the plant we're talking about, yeah, generally you cut that off down at the base. And again, you don't want to do that. You don't want to repot while it's in bloom. So in that case, you enjoy the blooms. And then after it's done blooming, then you repot, which hopefully will be during the springtime.
And no need to live with an ugly bloom stalk sticking
Absolutely
up,
not.
sad and dried out.
No, but here's the deal. They will often, I wait for a Phalaenopsis for the tip to turn tan. If it's still green, it might even, and there's no buds there, but the entire stem is still perfectly green, then there's a chance it might just sit there for a little while and it will still form new buds. And that's what's nice about a Phalaenopsis, that they can bloom and bloom and bloom and bloom, because unlike other orchids, the Phalaenopsis, as it's blooming, can continue developing flower buds. But again, first time you have it and you just got it from the supermarket, you know, that plant's probably a little extra stressed out, you know, but it's for people who have had orchids for years and they come into bloom in their own home. That's when they can last and bloom for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And it's not unheard of for orchids, Phalaenopsis orchids, to be in bloom for over a year in the home. So I want to point out, before I keep going on and taking this, that I've already had to remove, like, there's not some good looking roots on this, and they're literally just falling off here that are brown and mushy as I'm starting to pull this off. So this is one where you're not going to have the same success as all of those healthy white roots that we've had in the previous examples. Just work my way through it here. I wish I do not have the best lighting in here. I apologize for that. To see these detail type things. But what has happened on this orchid is there has been some signs of obvious rot, because what you see here is actually, this is the true root, this little thin part, and the really fat root is also the root. but a large part of that is called velamen, which is a spongy layer around the root. And I've lost a lot of the velamen on a lot of these roots. It literally is down here. So like, here's an example, like this root, I didn't even have to cut. It just fell off. And I could tell by the looks of my soil, and that's why I brought this plant in today, that I have probably been overwatering this over the past 2 years. And slowly I started rotting roots. There's an example of another root that's bad, that literally just fell off. So now I have to make the decision, like when I see, I'm gonna have to be a little bit more selective today on what I'm gonna take off of this plant. But, besides inspecting the roots, this is also a good time to get up really close and personal and look for insects and bugs. Mealybug and scale are two common pests of orchids, but now you can really get up close here. I'm going to get a fresh pair of scissors. I'm going to cut off this root here, and I'll try to show it to you up close. It might look like a nice fat root, but there's nothing here. It's papery, it's thin, it's black. There's no substance to it. So fortunately, I do have a couple of decent roots remaining. I'm going to cut this one off and just show, if you can kind of see, there was a big, let me try to see, where is it? A big section of black mushy rot right here. That part of the root was okay. I could have left that, but I feel daring today. So now, like in our last example, we actually, I'm going to take that. That's a bad root there. In our last example, we went up a pot size, and I'm tempted to go down a pot size for this guy. But he was also giving me warning signs, because a Phalaenopsis should, if you have a happy, healthy Phalaenopsis at home, each new leaf should be as large or slightly larger than the previous leaf. So, each leaf comes out from each side of the plant, and the next leaf will come out from this side, and then the next one from this side. This guy looks beautiful. Like, I can see the gradual progression in maturity. Now, when I look at this one, it looks like this is the newest leaf that's actually bigger, but look at this leaf that was from probably this time last year. It only grew about an inch. So this plant it was in trouble. And most likely that was directly correlated to this root issue as well. But I still have a few roots. Orchids can almost go down to no roots, because part of their annual cycle, they grow on about a 1-year annual cycle. And at one part of that cycle, which is always in spring, we generally start seeing either a new leaf or new roots come out. So don't necessarily fear if your plant has gone away to nothing. And so because of my lack of supplies here at the moment, I'm going to go with I don't really want to put it in the same pot again. I'm going to go into this size pot. I'm going to do my spiraling, trying to get in the light here. I'll do my spiraling technique to kind of start setting that plant down in again. Again, I'm not really pushing down on it too hard, because I don't want to snap those decent roots that are left. I am definitely resetting this one a little bit lower in the pot, because luckily I do see, and again, it's hard to see, but I have this really beautiful new root coming out here, and it's less than an inch long. And now that one, because of the traumatic, this plant's not doing as well, I'm going to be super careful about when I put my bark in around that, to not disturb that really pretty new root coming. So again, I'm just going to grab big chunks of media. I'm going to hold my plant with my 2 fingers. I guess that's my middle finger and my index finger in there nice and firm. The last thing you want when you're done is to have a wobbly orchid. So like, I should be able to wobble this plant, and he's in there good. If you were to wobble your plant and just flops out, well, then you haven't used enough pressure to put in, because you really want it to be firmly in there for when it decides to start rooting in. You don't want to plant wobbly. And that's kind of the general rule in all horticulture, no matter if you're orchid or not. You want a firm planting. So again, as you can see, like, I'm going kind of slow on this today, but I mean, I just took 6 handfuls in 30 seconds and filled in around this plant. It's not a labor intent. I mean, it's a mess, and you need a lot of supplies, but when you're actually down to actually doing it, it actually goes fairly quickly. And here at Hillwood, we can bang out quite a few plants, especially Phalaenopsis are particularly easy. So I'm going to say that guy is now done. He's got fresh media. We've recreated that. We've taken away that old, really kind of soured sphagnum moss. He's now in a nice chunky, airy medium. You know, once after you're done repotting, you do have to pay a little bit more attention because now you've just shifted that whole, your whole watering regime is now drastically different. You know, before, you know, as that bark decomposes or even the sphagnum moss gets a couple years old, like we were using, that stays moist a lot longer. Well, now I've put it into this brand new media that has a lot more drainage, a lot more air, and it's going to dry out a lot quicker. So I will actually pick up on the watering a little bit. Extra misting is super helpful at this point. Maybe if I had a super sunny window, maybe I don't put this plant immediately back into that super sunny window. Maybe I move it in a foot or two more, or give it a little bit more of a sheltered position. Phalaenopsis love to be outside, like on a screened-in porch during the summertime. So if you could do this operation in May or June, that's probably the moment of time where you have the least disturbance, because that's the time when the plants, you know, it's practically like a tropical environment during the summer months. But if we start at the beginning of the summer, then we're also, you know, allowing that plant to produce new roots over that long, nice, warm growing season. So this is why it's often recommended to repot your orchids in the spring, but that's a little bit of maybe that's too general. The other times are, okay, if you see signs of new roots, new shoots, new leaves, right? It's a sign that that plant's coming into active new growth. And most likely that would be the best time to repot, because then your roots can actively grow into that new media. And that just happens to coincide most often with spring or early summer. So your orchids tend to bloom, you know, right now, as Aaron mentioned, we have the most amount of blooms. It's really the months of February, March, and April are the most blooms in general. So we will not wait, but we will wait until most of them are blooming. But just like everybody at home, we don't get a bloom on every single orchid every single year here. So there's always something that's not blooming that we can work on. And it's this perpetual cycle of about every 2 years. You don't necessarily have to do it every 2 years. And I guarantee there's some folks watching that have never repotted their orchid and their orchid's so happy. And there's always exceptions to the rule. We're just really generalizing today.
And
so
Drew,
Aaron, I'm about to start this. Yeah, can you have any more questions?
Before we do, I'm going to hop in because we have a whole lot of great questions.
Okay.
One of the themes that I'm seeing come out talks a little bit, and you just mentioned that watering needs to change when your plant has fresh media. So let me see. Eve asked when you first water after repotting. I think that that's also getting at the fact that you've pre-soaked that bark.
Yeah.
So it's nice and wet already. Yeah. Do you water right after you get it settled in, or does that count as the first water?
I do, Aaron, because again, it's this fresh bark, right? That allows me to really just, I water immediately after. I take it to the sink at home. I use that little shower attachment. I thoroughly soak the plant. Again, making sure there's drainage holes, let it sit and drain for 5 minutes, and then put them back in its location. I wouldn't hesitate too much about not watering. I think it is a little trickier, you know, those first like 4 to 5 or 6 months until that bark starts to break down a little bit, you know, and starts holding a little bit more moisture. But again, bark size, bark type, you know, there's a lot of variables involved, but we're just being generalized today.
Well, and Robin asked another question about how plants do kind of settle into their media after the first couple of waterings, you know, over another month or so. Would you keep an eye on how much soil is in there and maybe add more potting mix if it seems like that's kind of compacted downward? Or is that good because we do want to leave lots of airflow?
Yeah, no, I think you could do both. I think if you occasionally what happens is your pots fall over and then half your soil comes out. I think it's another scenario. Yes, by
Have
all
you
means.
seen my kitchen sink lately, Drew?
Yeah, oh, I know. That's what happened. I'm surprised I haven't knocked over one of these yet. So, yeah, in that case, you just put some fresh media on. But yes, when I'm being more diligent and caring to my orchid collections, yes, I will at times just top it off. And especially because if you do, yes, please top it off.
I love it. I love it.
Okay. Yeah.
We've got a couple of other questions that are tied to watering.
Okay.
Marla, I think, was intrigued by your idea of moving things out and wondered if it's okay if an orchid stays outside in the rain,
Yeah.
particularly if it's heavy rain. You know, we had in the DC area some pretty strong storms last night. Is that something you would be cautious about?
So way too super early to put orchids outside so far, right? We want to wait until these are warm loving. There's different orchids out there, but the Phalaenopsis and the Cattleya are warm loving orchids that don't want to go outside until nights are consistently in the 60s or so. So we're talking about May. That's why I mentioned the screen-in porch is like the ideal situation for a low light orchid like a Phalaenopsis. It's low light's a terrible way to describe it, but because then you're in control of water. So yes, I summer my plants outside. I don't have a screened-in porch, and I often will get too much water on my plants. And the biggest issue you can have with the Phalaenopsis, particularly, is if you get too much water buildup inside the crown here, and you can rot your crown. So yes, you know, inside the home, I doubt you're ever going to get enough water buildup. But yet, if you had it outside and you had 5 storms in a row, 5 nights in a row, and that stayed really wet and humid, your crown could rot out, and that's almost a sign of a certain death for a Phalaenopsis if your center growing point turns to mush. Does that kind of clear that up, Erin?
I think so. I think there's just one more immediate post repotting watering question in the queue right now. And we've had a couple of folks ask about how soon after repotting you'd want to return to fertilizing. And I know this is something we talked about a lot with Orchid 101. But would you fertilize right away?
I'm going to talk about fertilizer. I'm also going to start repotting a Cattleya. The reason I chose this Cattleya is because according to our tag here at Hillwood, it was repotted last in June of 2019. So recent disturbances in the world has put us behind schedule here with our repotting. So this is almost approaching 3 years, but the plant looks very happy and healthy, but yet it was literally starting to bust at the seams. And so, you know, with the Cattleya, their growth is quite different than a Phalaenopsis. They're growing along a rhizome that's running along the soil surface. And the most recent year's growth was already starting to come up out of the side of the pot here. There's a new growth on this side that was also starting to get out. So I thought this is a perfect time, you know, when your plants get to the point where they're growing out over the lip of the plant or the lip of the pot, is a good time to repot. So, and hopefully, and again, and also that it had been almost 3 years. So you could see here, we really used a lot of bark, but I can already tell roots here are just falling off. So if they are able to just come off by me barely touching the plant, like these just literally came off and I'm barely pulling, then that's a good sign that they should come off. So as I tickle this guy loose of all this old media, fertilizing, it's the same thing with the watering. You know, you want to fertilize while the plants are actively in growth. You know, this is where I'm going to be super generic, and I'll just talk about the Phalaenopsis, because the Phalaenopsis tends to be slightly growing all year round. It doesn't really have a strict dormancy. So what you would do is during periods of the year where we have a lot more light and a lot more warmth, you would tend to water a little bit more and you would tend to fertilize a little bit more. And that would coincide with the spring, summer, and early fall months. But then during winter, when we have less sunlight, you know, and our homes generally tend to be a little cooler and such, especially if we're going near a window, right, where we don't have to water as often. And then, of course, then that means we're not fertilizing as often. So it's all about, you know, trying to get your plant onto a 1-year annual cycle. your Phalaenopsis should bloom once a year. Your Cattleyas should bloom once a year. There are some that are really happy goers out there that might bloom more than once a year, but typically most orchid growers and most orchids, you are quite happy if you get one bloom a year, or one bloom season. You might get 5 bloom stalks off of a big plant like this, but they're all going to kind of come at the same time, which often coincides with late winter after they've received a bit of a chill in the fall and a bit of a drier period. That's often one of those things that triggers orchids to come into bloom. So I know that was a roundabout answer, Erin, for you, but I know we are almost approaching our hour mark already. So I want to definitely get through this guy. As you can see, I'm still just pulling away, and down here in the ground is, not, I'd say maybe so far about 20% of the roots. I wish this plant, now normally we often get questions about dividing. I can almost feel how this guy's wanting to split on his own. Like I'm almost having to be a little bit careful to hold it together. We tend to like really large specimens here at Hillwood because then we get 5 bloom stalks instead of, we don't necessarily need 2 plants of everything. So we sometimes divide if we want to divide, but this would be a minimal size plant of a Cattleya that I would divide. And I would think, again, often they tell you how they want to divide themselves, but you would I could turn this into 2 pieces if I wanted, especially because I have a new growth on this side and a new growth on this side of the plant. I'd split it in half and turn it into 2. So I've almost gotten all of that old soil off. And the rest of the roots, look, they look pretty good. I'm going to say they're in that medium category, but yet they all look pretty linear. So I'm not going to go too terribly much more. I'm going to get another pair of fresh scissors. I'm going to trim off just a couple of these little stragglers that are hanging on here. And mainly for these, it's not so much the color. I can tell up close here that some are just flattened and desiccated and there's no substance to them, but I can tell others still are kind of plump. So I'm leaving those plump ones. I'm trying to get in here to the deep inside where it was probably staying the most moist and the most dark for the longest amount of time. But I'm thinking that's looking pretty good. Okay, so there's my final plant. I'm gonna go, it was in this size pot. We really like using pans here. This is a clay pan because it's shallow but wider, which tends to work pretty nicely for these epiphytic Cattleyas that grow horizontally and then they put out vertical shoots. And I'm going to hold it in here. And I'm going to use our Cattleya mix here at Hillwood. It's almost identical to what I was using from the store. Again, it's chunky media that's a type of bark mixed with big sponge rock, which is a nice perlite-like product that adds a lot of air and drainage. And there's also some charcoal in there, which is a common addition to orchids. So I'm going to hold my plant exactly where I want him to be at the right level. Again, I'm not starting with soil in the pot. I'll try to do this without making a huge mess. Put a little bit on the one side, put a little bit more on this side, patting it down as I go, trying to kind of cut my fingers too so that I can get up underneath the middle of it as well. If there's a few pockets of air, and gaps, that's perfectly fine in there because that's what they want. They want air and pockets. And I can already tell I feel pretty good about this. It already feels pretty stable here. I don't want to necessarily cover up those growing points because I just generally, I just don't like the idea of fresh media up on top of the crown of a plant.
And Drew, we've got some great eagle eyes coming in.
I mean, it's the same idea. It's the same idea. Just pushing it. Go ahead, Erin.
For this orchid mix,
Yep.
Jen wanted to clarify whether or not this has been soaked previously.
Yeah. Now, that's where, we fib a little bit here at Hillwood because we have a greenhouse and an orchid grower, and this will get watered tomorrow. No, and it is actually this is a ponderosa pine bark. It's not nearly as dry. What I have found, this is fir bark comes out of here. And I've just found in those bags like that, who knows how many years ago that was packaged. It's just so dry. So yeah, at Hillwood, we have such a big turnover so quickly. We don't pre-soak, but yet at home, if you know tomorrow morning is your orchid repotting day, right? I would go ahead and pre-soak your bark because you wouldn't want it to sit too long or it would start to sour and get kind of nasty. So I think that would be the fear if we pre-soaked it here. Yeah, but with that said, when we work with sphagnum moss, which we do occasionally use too, we do pre-soak that because it completely changes its consistency. Makes it a little bit more pliable than percolate.
Monica also asked for a little bit more information about where that large, I think you called it the sponge rock like perlite is, where you get that. And Tom also asked about what type of bark is best. And I think you started to speak to that just now.
You know, I mean, this is one of those questions. So we, a source that we like, there's two places, and I don't have any connection to these, but two places that we have ordered from over the years are Kelly's Orchid Supplies, and then it's Kelly's, Kelleys, Orchid Supplies online, and then there's repotme.com is another one that sells, and that's where you will open up Pandora's box because you will see 50 different options to choose from, but they probably sell perlite or similar related products in different sizes from small, medium, and large grade. You'll see different types of bark. This is ponderosa bark, I believe, or Pinus radiata, whatever that is. Is what we use here at Hillwood, and a product called Orchiata Mix is like the brand name. Again, most traditionally what was used was fir bark, and that was almost exclusively used back 20 years ago when I started with orchids. And I'm pretty sure that's what is made out of this particular product here. Is still fir bark. But the idea is do not use mulch from your garden or that hardwood mulch. That is completely different. That's shredded hardwood. This is true bark. This is more similar to like, this is called cork bark here. You know, it's a totally different product. So with that said, I'm all done, my guy here. He's nicely recentered. He now has a year or two worth of space before so when those new growths come out on a Cattleya, shortly after the new growth comes out, new roots come out. I already see the new growth is about the size of half of my pinky fingernail. So it has begun. Once that new growth comes out about an inch or two or 3 or 4 inches, it will send out a whole new set of roots. And really then those new roots will now come down into the pot. And I have the opportunity now to really get a really good season's growth or 2 seasons of growth, revamping that epiphytic nature in that pot. And plus, it just looks a lot cleaner and nicer. It's always, plants always look prettier and perkier right after planting. So, Erin, what else do we got? We got a few more minutes here. What else do we got?
We sure do. Marla asked, you mentioned that you didn't start with any medium in that pot.
Yeah.
Why not?
Oh, that's a good question. I think because I want to make sure because okay, so in orchids, if you're repotting and you're doubtful of do I go in a small pot or a big pot, right? You always want to pick the smaller pot. Like if you can't judge, so because of that, normally I pick a pot where if I had enough room to put soil in the bottom before I even started putting roots in, then that pot's probably way too large, right? So that's why I'm choosing small pots. Your underpotting would be the expression compared to a typical house plant. If you're repotting a peace lily, right, that's in a pot like this, we don't even think about it. We automatically go up into a pot like this. We take that existing root ball out. And then that case, I would put about an inch of soil in the bottom. I sit that old root ball and then I fill it. So that would be, that is how I would pot a traditional houseplant, but yet on a traditional houseplant, we're not removing all that old soil. We're just bumping it up a pot size. Orchids, a totally different scenario. We're not necessarily bumping it up unless the roots really demand us to bump it up.
Excellent. Anne-Marie asked about when you would cut off and pot a kiki.
Oh, yeah. So kikis are little babies that grow often on the bloom stalk of a Phalaenopsis. So kiki is just, another term for a baby. So often what will happen on a Phalaenopsis stem is instead of a flower or for one reason or another, a little baby plant will form at one of the nodes along the stem. And then it'll form little leaves. And then after a little while, that keiki will put out little roots. And you want to wait until you see some roots that are a couple inches long. And then you can use whatever tool possible. Maybe it's a razor blade or a scalpel or scissors. You literally just can disconnect him from the stem, and then he could go in its own pots. But yeah, you would want to wait for roots to form. And then that would be a great scenario because it's a baby little plant where I would definitely sort out my potting, my bark, and maybe use all the little smaller pieces of bark rather than I don't want to use huge chunks because it's a little baby with tiny little roots. Does that make sense?
That makes great sense. Mila asked if an orchid hasn't rebloomed in a couple of years, would you try to force it into blooming by repotting or fertilizing, or would you just start by watching Orchid 101 on YouTube?
Oh, Erin, you knew exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, no, that is literally, we talk about that for an hour, right? That's all Orchid 101 is basically you have to grow a healthy plant in order to get to bloom. And we talk a lot about getting your plant on that 1 year annual cycle. So repotting does not encourage reblooming unless your plant's just sick and unhealthy. And that would be the reason you would repot, that then might have a chance of that plant rejuvenating so it has a chance of blooming. But no, it's a lot about light, water, and temperature, and fluctuating those over the course of a 1 year cycle is really the trick that gets things to bloom. And luckily we have a greenhouse, which is super easy to use water, light, and temperature as the three big cultural requirements. By adjusting those over the course of the year, we get our plants on a cycle. And that's why everybody starts blooming in February, March, and April, right?
And we've got now 3 different questions about leaves and leaf colors.
Yep.
So I'm going to gang all of those up into one, and I know that you'll need to answer them separately. But Eve asked about leaves that are starting to turn yellow. Adele asked about leaves that are starting to turn brown. And Sandra asked about leaves on her blooming orchid that are starting to kind of wrinkle. And Sandra in particular, with those wrinkly leaves, said, am I overwatering or underwatering? Because
it could be either.
It's probably one of those, right?
It probably is. What that's a sign of is that the roots are not able to absorb moisture. So is it because it's been underwatered and there's just simply not enough water there? But yet overwatering will rot the roots, which will often be expressed in the same way up top, which is wrinkling and dehydrated foliage. So yes, so that's something where you would just have to think back over the past year, like, what do you think it is? But yet, if you have a plant that's failing and you haven't repotted it in a year or two, right, that would be the time to go and inspect those roots, right? That would be a good reason to do it, especially if it's not blooming, you have wrinkly leaves, and you're unsure of the root scenario. Yeah,
and go find out.
And find out, right? And when it comes to yellow or brown leaves, if we're talking about Phalaenopsis here, right? It's different stories for different plants. But if it's the bottom leaves, that is natural for those to turn yellow one at a time. And then those you just simply can remove or cut off carefully. If it's the growing point, it's the absolute opposite. That's the worst point to get mushy. We already talked about that. If it's a big lesion on one of the newer leaves, well, that's a little bit more of a tricky scenario. And that browning could it be sunburn? Could it be that your plant fell over and fell off the table and it's physical injury? Like there's so many things that could cause brown and yellow leaves. It's hard to diagnose necessarily what it is, but part of that is just natural if it's the oldest ones.
And Fran just asked a great follow-up question about those wrinkly leaves.
Yep.
Is that something that you would cut off and remove? I know you just mentioned that's a possibility for the yellow or browning leaves.
No, if it's green and wrinkly, I would not cut those off because there's a really good chance that they will replump up once appropriate environmental conditions are returned.
Excellent. I am keeping my eye on the corner of my screen here, and I know we have just about a minute left. We've got 4 more questions in the queue, so Drew and I will stick around and get to those. Thank you for your patience and for being with us. I absolutely understand if you need to scoot off to your 1:30 meeting or something else going on this afternoon. Like Orchid 101, this program is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel probably sometime early next week. So thank you all for joining us. I hope we see you in person at Hillwood soon. But in the meantime, Drew, going on about questions about leaves turning colors they shouldn't be, Steph asked what yellow leaves mean on her cattleya.
Yeah, so on a cattleya, again, my first follow-up question, right? It's hard without seeing the plant. Is it the older pseudobulbs or is it the brand new pseudobulbs? It's the same idea. If your new shoot coming out for the year turns black and mushy, oh, that's a bad, bad sign. But it's perfectly natural if that was a shoot that was 4 or 5 shoots back. That is what naturally happens. Of course, the example I have here, oh yeah, there they are. There are pseudobulbs that don't have any more leaves anymore. Like these had a big leaf, but they were back 3-4 years ago. They turn yellow. We snip them off once they turn yellow. So, but it could be a lot of signs. Like, again, the idea of fertilizer doesn't necessarily make or break an orchid, but yet, that's something that could be a variable. Like I would ask, have you fertilized the orchid? Like, are you fertilizing once or twice a month during that active growing season, right? If you've never fertilized your orchid in 4 years, well, that would probably contribute to yellow leaves, right? So, or, again, are the roots an issue, right? Like often roots, or, they often say in horticulture, you're not really growing good plants, you're growing good roots. And the roots really dictate what happens on the top of the plant. So again, the reason why, if you haven't repotted in, 3 years, like you might be able to push it to 3 years, but after that point, you're really rolling the dice of what's happening to your roots. And yeah, you lose roots, you're going to lose foliage on top. So yeah, I hope that helped clarify that a wee bit.
I think so. We got a couple of other questions that are very directly about repotting, so I'm going to ask those first. We are still getting a few more questions, and we'll keep plugging away at them. So thank you for your patience. Don't worry, we haven't forgotten about them. But we had a couple of questions earlier about reusing pots and whether you would always clean a pot again, or if you're replanting the same plant in its original pot, would you use it as is?
That's a good question. If you're repotting into the same pot, I wouldn't worry about it. At home, I'm not probably as good as we are here. Here, we sanitize all of our pots. If you want to clean a clay pot, it actually involves, you'd have to Google it. It's something like 400 degrees in the oven for an hour or so to sterilize it effectively. We have different types of disinfectants here that we will clean out our green pots with. It's a lot of the same things that we'll use as like standard greenhouse disinfectants. But at home, a 10% bleach solution is probably the easiest way to control a lot. If you're concerned about fungal diseases or an unclean pot, 10% bleach solution will not get rid of everything. It doesn't protect against virus, but it will get rid of 90% or more of all those pathogens. You let it soak for 15 minutes and then let it air dry. The same with your scissors, your utensils. Here we're, today I probably wasn't as good as we should be, but when we're repotting here, even our orchids, we do lay down a lot of newspaper. We'll crumble all that up between each plants. We will wash our hands. We often use latex gloves. And if we get into juicy plant material, we are switching out gloves. We're sterilizing our scissors with a flame torch between plants. So, but yeah, if it's your own pots and you only have a couple orchids at home, I really wouldn't worry too much. But 10% bleach, that would do it.
Excellent. We also got a question from someone who has an orchid that's currently planted with an anthurium in the same pot. I'm wondering if it's okay to keep those two together when you repot, or if you really should separate them.
Yeah. I would definitely, if I actually went to the troubles of repotting, I would separate the two. Anthuriums are not epiphytes generally. They are generally grown in more of a traditional potting soil. And then the orchid could go in an epiphytic mix, and then your anthurium could go in a more traditional potting soil type thing. But with that said, Aaron, all these questions say this is why there's so many different opinions with growing orchids and plants in general, because plants want to survive, they want to grow, right? And there's so many different factors that influence a plant's, health, that, just repotting is just one of them. But yeah, generally those two are not too compatible. And I don't like seeing when, they often mix the Phalaenopsis with other, like in mixed planters or even glass fish bowls. Marketing folks do whatever they want with plants. And then it's our job as gardeners to really give them what it's going to make them to thrive, right?
I love that. You mentioned already differing opinions and lots of different ways to care for plants. Kathy asked if you would ever combine some sphagnum moss with a bark medium, or if those two are really mutually exclusive.
There's different schools of opinion on that. We did that for a while with our Phalaenopsis collection. Again, because they like a little bit more moisture, we would use maybe about 80% bark and then about 20% sphagnum, so that it actually retained a little bit more moisture, and that would slow that quick drainage. But then over time, we realized that maybe that was keeping it too moist. So, and that is, I have read in the back of my head, I remember, at some point being, this idea that yes, mixing those two often creates layers in your pot, which maybe is not most desirable. But when I use sphagnum, again, maybe like that little kiki for babies, or if it's a plant that really lost all of its roots and I need like an intensive care, sometimes we'll put little plants like that into sphagnum, because we feel like maybe that moisture is a little bit more consistent. If you don't have any roots, maybe having a lightly damp sphagnum moss might be a little bit nicer around your neck than, a couple big chunks of dry bark. So there are different schools of thought to that. But yeah, if you're growing moisture loving orchids, that tends to lend itself more towards sphagnum. Dry loving orchids or orchids that need a strict dormancy tends to lean more towards bark. And then there's everything in between too, that you can intermingle. And this is where, professional orchid growers, and that's here too. Me and Andrew have been doing this for almost 10 years, and we are still tweaking our potting medias each season that we go around. And as you learn and you grow and you see what works well for you, your environment, your watering schedule, right? Because it's all a holistic thing. And again, repotting and bark's just one of them.
I love that. Now, Fran mentioned that she has an orchid that has many, many, many aerial roots.
Yeah,
I was wondering if that is a sign that the orchid needs to be repotted.
Sometimes, but not always. It depends on the orchid. So if there's roots in the pot and out in the air, but I have read, if you have a really spoiled media and it's been several years old, you often see when we have repotting clinics, you often see the ones that have been in the same pot for 5 years. And the only thing that's left are these aerial roots, but that's because the new roots come out higher and higher up the stem, so there's often even like a bare stem, and the stuff that's actually in the soil has been rotted for years. But yet, because it's an epiphyte and they've still been watering and getting those aerial roots moist, right? It's still uptaking nutrients and moisture, but yet maybe not necessarily from the roots in the pot. So it could be a sign of multiple things.
When you repot, do you tend to put all of those aerial roots in? Some, none?
None. If I don't have to, like this one, my own from home, the same 3 roots that were outside when I started, they're still outside. I think that's attractive. I think it's a fun aspect of growing orchids. But those plants, but if I had to cut all those old roots off, then I might, use warm water to soak those roots, make them a little bit more pliable. And I would push them in just enough so that there would be something in the pot that actually helped hold the plant there in position. But otherwise, no, aerial roots I generally do not force into the pots. You can see our beautiful example here from Hillwood's collection that's in bloom. You can see all these aerial roots dangling out, and that's perfectly happy and healthy. There's no need to force them into the pot.
I love that. Well, we have just one more question, and I thank all of you who have stayed with us till the bitter end. Drew, what do you recommend for fertilizer? Other than, I know we did talk about this for a while during Orchid 101 and the different types of fertilizer for different types of growth.
So orchid fertilizer, because they're epiphytes, they tend to be, they don't need a ton of fertilizer, right? So the caution would be, it's not necessarily which type, it would be to make sure you don't apply too heavy of a dose. So if they do market, I don't have examples here today, but there are specific little tiny bottles of orchid fertilizer if you just have an orchid or two. But what generally they tend to be very, very diluted. And then you further dilute them when you mix, a teaspoon into a gallon of water. But because they're formulated for orchids, you can safely follow directions. The trickier part is if you use a Miracle Grow, you'd want to cut it way, 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 way back from what it might even say for a standard house plant that's not an epiphyte. So, so with that said, I would recommend an orchid fertilizer that's marketed for that. They often sell two. There's one for normal growth, and there's one that's often called for blooming, right? And so you would use what I do at home. I have both. I use my one for standard, the green or, vegetative growth. The vast majority of the year, starting all from now all the way through August, September, October, but yet towards the end of summer is where I will start dabbling in a little bit of that bloom booster, because I know that plant towards end of summer, fall, I'm going to combine that with decreasing daylight, decreasing temperatures, and now I'm putting in a fertilizer that's for blooming, because I know coming up soon that plant's going to start, I don't know if they think, but they're going to start getting to that point of thinking like, okay, it's time to maybe slow down my vegetative growth and put out a bloom stalk. So I know I just kind of recapitulated all of 101 all there in one sentence, but
I love it.
But yeah, so
you get more and more concise each year. No, but if you have more questions about fertilizer, I highly recommend that Orchid 101 video, which is up on YouTube already. Loretta asked when this repotting demonstration will be up. I would hope that that's up early next week, say Monday or Tuesday. Feel free to check over the weekend. Sometimes folks are able to get lots of the behind the scenes work done really quickly, but I am not involved in that, and I know they have been very busy this week. So early next week is a pretty safe bet. Drew, thank you for walking us through all of this today and for answering so many great questions. Thank you to our audience for joining us, and especially for those of you who have stuck around till the very end. We appreciate your time, and it's been a great way for us to start our weekend. I hope you'll come and visit Hillwood soon and enjoy the fruits of Drew's labor inside the greenhouse.
Bye, everyone.